The fat one will fetch less money. Slavers laughed Mountain Man, made them beg for death. The fat one will fetch less money, the slaver jeered, flicking his reins as if she were nothing more than a slow mule.
We have to go.
Laughter
They're on
broke
to us.
over the road like thrown gravel. Mary Blackwell stood with her wrists bound and her cheeks burning, dust clinging to the tear tracks she refused to wipe away. She had been a nurse on her way west, a woman of steady hands and stubborn hope. Now she was a prize on a chain, appraised in meat weight and mocked for it. "Walk," snarled Silas Crane. "I won't waste a horse on you." Each step jarred the blisters that had opened during the forced march. When she stumbled, Dutch shoved her shoulder hard enough to steal her breath. "Hear that?" he said to no one and everyone. "Dead weight wheezes." Mary lifted her chin. "If I am dead weight, it's because men like you killed the ones who carried the rest." The camp drew its semicircle in a narrow gulch by nightfall, firelight licking tin cups and gunmetal. The slavers drank and boasted. Mary drank silence and counted heartbeats. Survival had rhythms. Breathe in, do not break. Breathe out, do not beg. "Because she's worth less," Dutch muttered, drifting closer. "I'll take my cut early." "Touch her," Silas warned, "and you'll cost us coin." They laughed again, a sound without warmth, and the night grew thinner, the wind sharper, the stars pitilessly bright. Somewhere a coyote called. Somewhere a memory of a real life tried to speak and failed. Across the ridge, a single shape paused against the sky, a man carved from the same stone the mountains kept for themselves. Ezekiel Wolfe watched the fire through the iron scope of his calm, counting bodies, measuring angles, listening as if the night itself were briefing him. Mary closed her eyes and prayed to be seen. The ridgeline answered with a shadow that moved. By daylight, the insult lingered like grit between teeth. Mary had learned long ago that some rooms were kinder when she made herself small. On the road, there was no room to shrink into. She was soft-armed and broad-hipped, a woman built like harvest, not hunger, and every mile the men turned her shape into a weapon against her. They rationed her water shorter, her sleep thinner. When she bent to rub a blister, Dutch counted aloud as if timing a plow horse. When she straightened, Silas tipped his hat with a showman's bow. All performance, no mercy. She answered them by surviving. She kept her gaze level. She parceled breath and prayer. She took stock the way she had in crowded wards back east, where the air smelled of ether and iron, and hands shook because the next stitch decided whether a man kept his blood. She knew how to steady a fever. She knew how to hold a stranger's hand while the floor fell away. She knew, above all, that a body could be mocked and still be magnificent at staying alive. The country they cut across did not care who jeered. Pinon and juniper threw their dark shapes over shale. A creek stitched the gulch with a sound like whispered advice, too faint to follow. Coyotes trotted the rim with the casual entitlement of locals. Late sun smeared copper over everything and then slipped out of its shift, leaving the world in iron. On the far ridge, Ezekiel Wolfe read the camp the way some men read Scripture. He took in the slope of the ground, the arc of firelight, the lazy way a guard's muzzle sagged when his cup was full. A cavalry scout once, he had moved through years of noise until silence became his native language. The lines on his face had been carved there by wind and regret. The left shoulder ached when rain threatened. The right ear rang when memory did. He wore his hair tied back because loose things had a habit of catching on thorns. He did not linger on what the men had said. Words like theirs were cheap. What held him was the small, precise economy with which the woman bore them. She did not spit back every time because she was counting strength, not scoring points. When Dutch sidled close at dusk, grinning the way cowards grin, she angled her body so the kick would send him off balance and then took the slap without crumpling. She turned her cheek and met the night with eyes that refused to be turned into a ledger of shame. He had tracked Silas Crane 6 months across county lines and fresh graves. Some promises a man made out loud. Others he made to the part of himself that still believed in straight things, like trails and spines and justice. The promise that had brought him here was simple. Bring them home if they can be brought. End it if it cannot be ended any other way. When full dark pooled in the gulch, the camp loosened. Cards slapped. Bottles tilted. The guard on the north side leaned back against a boulder and let the stars do his watching. Zeke moved. He was not fast for the sake of speed, but for the sake of not giving the world time to change its mind. A shadow detached from a darker shadow, crossed gravel without a single betraying crunch, and became a hand that closed a mouth and a blade that kissed a throat, quick and professional. By the time the body slumped, he was already at the next point in the pattern he had solved. He reached the 3 prisoners where the horses were tied, cut the first 2 free, pressed a finger to his lips, and pointed them toward the dry wash that would hide their shapes. Then he knelt by Mary. Up close, he could see the heat along her blistered heels, the sharpness of dehydration in the way her tongue touched cracked lips. He could also see that her chin had a stubborn tilt, meant for more than defiance. It was built for vows. "I can move," she whispered, though her legs trembled with the lie. "I know," he said, and put his arms under her anyway, lifting as if he were retrieving something that mattered. She tensed, not from shame now, but from the surprise of being held without contempt. He adjusted his stance so her weight rested against his chest and not on the ropes that had burned her wrists. The old scout's care showed in details like that. Behind them, Dutch laughed at some crude joke. Silas answered with a drawled promise of profit. The sound chased Zeke to the edge of the wash, but did not catch him. He set Mary down in the shadow of a cottonwood and cut her bindings. She swallowed and blinked hard. "They said I was worth less," she murmured, not asking for reassurance, only recording the day's weather. "They were wrong," he said, not to comfort her, but because the sentence required correction. He handed her a canteen and a strip of jerky, then turned back toward the fire with his pistols low and ready, the easy, lethal posture of a man who had decided how this night would end. In the space he left behind, Mary drew a breath that did not taste of humiliation for the first time since the road ambushed her life. Dawn came like a bruise over the mountain's purple first, then raw gold spilling down the slopes. Smoke still rose from the camp Zeke had left behind, the last of the slavers' laughter silenced by gunfire and dust. He led the women westward through a canyon where the river whispered between stones. 2 of them were strong enough to walk. Mary leaned on a branch he'd shaped into a cane, her breath uneven but steady, her will the one thing that refused to falter. The land around them was both cruel and breathtaking. Tall pines with silver bark, ravens tracing black hieroglyphs across the sky, and cliffs the color of old blood. Zeke moved through it as though the earth had once been his home, and he'd simply returned. Every few steps he glanced back at Mary, not pitying, but assessing, calculating distance and endurance the way a soldier measures time. When the sun reached its peak, they stopped beside a creek. Zeke knelt, scooped water into his hands, and washed the grime from his neck. Then he turned, handed Miri his canteen, and said quietly, "Drink slow. Your body's forgotten kindness." Her lips trembled against the tin. "You saved me," she said. "You could have left." He shook his head. "I don't leave the living to die. That's not mercy. That's laziness." She smiled weakly. "You talk like a preacher." "Used to believe in something," he replied. "Lost the habit. Might find it again." For a while they walked in silence. Miri watched the way his shoulders moved slow, deliberate, every motion a lesson in control. He carried the guilt of a man who'd seen too much death and still believed he should have stopped it. The scar along his jaw caught the sunlight like a reminder that he'd already bled for too many. That night, they camped under a canopy of stars. The women huddled together near the fire, whispering about home. Zeke sat apart, carving a piece of cedar into something shapeless. Miri couldn't sleep. She watched him, the way the firelight softened his face, how his eyes held both peace and ruin. After a while she spoke. "I was going to California to work at a hospital. They said they needed nurses." He didn't look up. "They still do." "Maybe," she said, "but after this, I'm not sure who I am anymore." Zeke placed the unfinished carving in her hand. "Then start with this. It's nothing now, but shape it, give it purpose. That's how you remember yourself." Her fingers closed around the wood, and for the first time in days, she felt something that wasn't fear. It was weight, solid and real. Later, when the wind grew cold, Zeke rose without a word and laid his coat over her shoulders. Miri tried to protest, but he cut her off with a look. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's harder." He returned to his place beside the fire, gun resting across his knees. The mountains loomed around them, vast and indifferent, yet in that small circle of flame, something tender had taken root, a quiet, wordless trust between the man who refused to abandon and the woman who refused to break. In the distance, a wolf howled. Miri's heart jumped, but Zeke's voice, low and calm, reached her through the dark. "You're safe. Nothing gets past me." She believed him. For the first time since the attack, she let her eyes close without fear. 3 days later, the forest opened like a curtain to reveal a narrow valley veined with snowmelt and the quiet curl of smoke from a lone chimney. Zeke's cabin stood there half hidden by spruce, sturdy as if it had grown straight out of the mountain itself. When they reached it, Miri could barely stand. Her feet were blistered, her voice cracked from cold air, and her body felt like it had been carved hollow by exhaustion. Zeke carried her the last stretch, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of cedar and something faintly sweet beeswax, pine pitch, and the ghost of coffee. A rifle hung above the hearth. Tools lined the walls with a soldier's precision, yet the space felt lived in, not lonely. A wool blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a tin cup resting on a book with the corners worn smooth. Zeke set her down near the fire. "You'll rest here," he said. "I can help," Miri murmured. "You will," he replied, tending the fire, "but not tonight." He moved with quiet certainty, building warmth the way other men built walls piece by piece, methodical, protecting without saying the word. He boiled water, crushed herbs, and cleaned her wounds. His hands were large, scarred, and impossibly gentle. When he rapped her feet, she winced. "I've treated men before," she whispered, trying to distract herself. "Soldiers, miners, farmers, they never thanked the nurse until they were dying." Zeke gave a ghost of a smile. "Then I'll thank you now, while I've still got breath." Days passed in the rhythm of recovery. The two women he'd rescued left for the nearest town once they could travel, promising to send word of Mirie's survival. After they were gone, silence filled the cabin like snowfall, soft, heavy, intimate. Mirie began to move about on her own. She cleaned, cooked, and mended a tear in Zeke's shirt. At first, she did it from gratitude, then because she found peace in the small sounds, the scrape of a knife on wood, the whisper of fabric, the slow crackle of the hearth. Zeke often worked outside, chopping wood or checking his snares. When he returned, the smell of snow followed him in. He'd pause at the doorway, his frame filling it entirely, before nodding to her a wordless greeting that somehow said more than speech. One afternoon, she found him on the porch, carving again. The piece of cedar from the journey had become the faint outline of a dove. "You finished it," she said. He looked up. "Not yet. Still learning how to make something delicate without breaking it." Their eyes met, and for a long moment the air between them held something fragile and new. As winter deepened, their routine became a kind of quiet partnership. Mirie taught Zeke how to brew medicine from willow bark. Zeke showed her how to aim a rifle, though her hands trembled. "It's not about killing," he said. "It's about knowing you can stand your ground." At night, she read aloud from an old Bible she'd found on his shelf. He didn't kneel or pray, but he listened as if each word reminded him of a time when he'd still believed in light. Sometimes, when the wind howled and the world outside disappeared under snow, Zeke would pour her tea and say, almost to himself, "You make this place feel human again." And Mirie would answer softly, "You make it feel safe." The fire burned low. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was warm and full and alive. By the time the snow began to thaw, Mirie could walk through the valley without the cane. The cabin had become more than a refuge, it was a heartbeat. The mornings carried the sound of coffee dripping, boots against floorboards, and sometimes laughter that surprised them both. Yet peace in the frontier was never built to last. It started with a single horse print down by the creek, deep, fresh, and not Zeke's. He noticed it first, his brow tightening as he crouched to study the ground. "Someone's been here," he muttered. "Recently." Mirie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Could it be a trapper? He shook his head. A trapper wouldn't ride this deep unless he's following something. That night, Zeke oiled his guns and checked every window latch. When Mirie tried to speak, he only said, "If trouble finds us, you stay behind me. Understand?" But trouble wasn't just coming from the woods, it was clawing its way out of the past. 3 days later, while gathering herbs near the ridge, Mirie found a wanted poster half buried under snow. The paper was torn, the ink smeared, but the name was clear. Silas Crane, dead or alive. Beneath it, a sketch of his face, and next to it, scrawled in red pencil, Wolf. Her stomach turned cold. She knew that name. It wasn't just his last name. It was his burden. That night, as Zeke sat by the fire sharpening his knife, Mirie finally asked, "You were hunting him long before me, weren't you? Silas Crane." Zeke's hand stilled. The whetstone hung in silence between them. "Yes," he said at last. "I was tracking him for months. He took something from a friend of mine, a family actually, a wife, a daughter. His voice roughened. I buried them myself. Mary swallowed. And now? He looked at her. Now I've buried him. But men like Crane don't die alone. There'll be others. She wanted to ask more, but there was something in his eyes, the weight of memory, the ghost of guilt that told her enough. He had been chasing vengeance for so long, he'd forgotten what peace even looked like. Until her. The following morning, smoke rose from the southern ridge. 2 riders appeared before noon. Zeke saw them first through the spyglass and cursed under his breath. Crane's kin, he said. The Maddox brothers. They'll be looking for payback. Mary's pulse quickened. We can leave? No, he interrupted. Running only brings them closer. We hold ground. He moved with the cold focus of a soldier, checking ammunition, setting traps along the path, reinforcing the cabin door. Mary helped without being told, gathering bandages, boiling water, her mind steady, even as her heart pounded. When the riders finally reached the clearing, one of them shouted, "We know you're in there, Wolf. You killed our brother-in-law, and now we'll take the woman as payment." Mary's hands tightened around the rifle Zeke had taught her to hold. "They're here for me," she whispered. Zeke's jaw clenched. "No, they're here for blood. They just don't know whose they'll spill." Outside, the horses stamped and snorted. Inside, the fire snapped, throwing restless shadows across the cabin walls. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mary said quietly, "If I hadn't been taken, you'd never have crossed their path again." He turned toward her, eyes dark with something fierce and unspoken. "Don't ever say that. Saving you wasn't a mistake. It's the first right thing I've done in years." The first bullet tore through the window pane, splintering wood and glass into a storm of shards. Zeke lunged forward, pulling Mary down behind the overturned table just as another shot cracked through the door. The smell of gunpowder and pine filled the cabin, sharp and metallic. "Stay low," he barked, reloading with the speed of muscle memory. 2 of them, maybe 3. They'll try to flank us from the ridge." Mary's heart hammered in her throat. She clutched the rifle he'd taught her to hold, her fingers trembling but ready. Outside, the horses whinnied, and a voice called out, rough, mocking, "Wolf, you think killing Silas ends it? He was our blood. Hand over the woman, and maybe we'll make it quick." Zeke's reply was a single gunshot, echoing through the valley like thunder. One of the men screamed and fell. Silence, then curses. "Now they're angry," Zeke muttered. "Good. Angry men make mistakes." He glanced at Mary, and for a heartbeat she saw something soft beneath the steel fear, not for himself, but for her. "You remember what I taught you?" She nodded, voice shaking. "Breathe. Don't rush. Aim for what matters." "That's my girl," he said quietly, then rose and fired through the shattered window 2 shots in quick succession. Another cry rang out. A single rider remained, Cole Maddox, broad-shouldered, his face twisted with fury. He dismounted, drew his revolver, and advanced toward the cabin shouting, "You took my kin! I'll take yours!" Zeke stepped into the doorway. "I've got none left," he said coldly, "but you're welcome to join them." Cole fired first. Zeke ducked, the bullet grazing his arm. Blood streaked his sleeve, but he didn't stop. He returned fire, hitting Cole's shoulder. The outlaw stumbled, dropped to one knee, and with a snarl aimed again, this time at Mary, who had risen behind the table. The world narrowed to a heartbeat. Mary remembered the nights Zeke had made her practice, the steady weight of the rifle, his voice calm in her ear. Don't fight the wind, breathe with it. She did. One slow exhale, one pull of the trigger. Cole Maddox fell backwards into the snow. The silence afterward was deafening. Only the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of Zeke's breathing filled the cabin. He turned to her, blood running down his arm, and said softly, "Hell, you got better aim than me." Miri's rifle slipped from her hands as tears blurred her vision. "I didn't want to." He crossed the room, caught her shoulders, and said firmly, "You did what you had to. You saved us both." For a moment, neither spoke. The snow drifted lazily outside, the kind that muffles every sound, even grief. Zeke bandaged his arm with one of her torn skirts, and together they buried the bodies at the edge of the clearing. No prayers, just a long silence for men who'd chosen their fate. When it was done, they stood side by side, breath misting in the cold air. Miri whispered, "It's over." Zeke nodded, eyes on the mountains. "For now, but the past doesn't vanish easy out here." Then he turned to her, voice low. "Still, if you want to go, if you've had enough of this place, I'll take you wherever you wish. You deserve peace." She looked at him, the scars, the steadiness, the kindness he hid beneath that hard shell, and said, "I already found it." He blinked, as if he hadn't heard right. "With you," she added. He didn't answer, but his hand found hers, rough and warm, the way home must feel to those who've wandered too long. Spring crept slowly into the valley, softening the ground where blood and snow had mingled. The days lengthened, the river thawed, carrying away the silence of winter. Zeke's cabin, once a place of ghosts, began to breathe again. Miri stood on the porch one morning, her skirts brushing against the wood, the air crisp with the scent of pine and sunlight. She watched Zeke mend the fence line, his movement steady, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing the scar she had stitched herself. He looked up and caught her watching. "You should rest that ankle," he called. She smiled. "And let you do all the work? Not likely." It was the first time she'd teased him, and the sound of her laughter reached him like bird song after too long a winter. He set down his tools and walked toward her, boots crunching softly in the thawing earth. Inside, the cabin glowed with small signs of new life, herbs drying from the rafters, a basin of clean water, the faint hum of something content. Miri had turned one corner into a tiny infirmary, and neighbors from distant homesteads had already begun coming for help. She refused payment. Zeke said that was foolish. She only smiled and told him that healing people was her way of paying the world back for sparing her. Some nights, when the wind carried the smell of rain, they sat by the fire. Zeke would listen to her read letters from the families of the other rescued women, words filled with gratitude and news of babies born, fields planted, lives rebuilt. He never said much, but when she finished, he'd murmur, "Worth every scar." One evening, as dusk painted the valley blue, Miri stepped onto the porch and leaned into him. His arm slid naturally around her shoulders, protective, unthinking. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The road, the hunt?" He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think justice was the only thing keeping me alive," he said. "But now, maybe it was just waiting for me to find a reason to stop fighting." She turned her face toward him, her eyes shimmering in the fading light. "And have you found it?" Zeke smiled faintly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You tell me." The world beyond the valley would always be harsh, full of men like Crane and Maddox, of loss and hunger and cruelty. But here, between these mountains, something else had taken root, a stillness that did not feel empty. As night fell, the cabin windows glowed like lanterns against the dark. Inside, two shadows moved, not lost souls anymore, but people who had chosen to build instead of bury. Mary rested her head on Zeke's shoulder and whispered, "You said once that I wasn't worth much to them." He kissed her temple, voice rough with feeling. "To me, you're everything." Outside, the wind shifted softer now, almost like a sigh of blessing through the pines. "You're safe here," he murmured. Mary closed her eyes and smiled, her voice barely a breath. "I know." The fire crackled. The night held its peace. And far off, where the mountains met the stars, the story waited, not ended, only begun. Every time I finish a story like this, I'm reminded that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about kindness. Mary survived cruelty not by hardening, but by holding on to her compassion. Zeke found redemption not through revenge, but by protecting something fragile and realizing that love can rebuild what vengeance destroys. Maybe that's what the wild frontier teaches best. The world can be merciless, but hearts still find their way home. If this story found a place in your heart, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Wyoming? Texas? Vietnam? Germany? Somewhere quiet where you can still hear the wind through the trees? Your comments, every single one, remind me why these stories matter, how they connect strangers across mountains, oceans, and languages. And if you still believe in second chances, in love that grows out of pain, and in people who refuse to let cruelty have the last word, then don't go far. The next story is already waiting for you, because out here in the heart of the wild, every whisper, every scar, and every act of mercy still has the power to change a life.